Imagine the most powerful man in Europe slowly transforming into a living corpse before his subjects' eyes. Henry VIII Tudor, the king who executed 2 wives and turned the religious map of the continent upside down, was dying so agonizingly that his own doctors recoiled in horror. January 28, 1547. Whitehall Palace is shrouded in mourning silence. Behind the massive oak doors of the royal chambers unfolds a scene that will go down in history as one of the most gruesome royal death agonies. But the worst is yet to come. What the doctors will discover during the autopsy will force us to reconsider the entire history of this monarch's reign. Henry VIII entered history as the Bluebeard of English kings. 6 wives, 2 executions, the break with Rome, the dissolution of monasteries. His reign changed the course of European history. But few consider that the final years of this political giant's life were overshadowed by a mysterious illness that transformed the once athletic, handsome man into a bloated, rotting monster. Modern historians and doctors still debate what exactly killed the king. The official 16th century version sounded cautious and vague. God's will. But documents from that era, ambassadors' letters, and courtiers' diaries paint an entirely different picture. A picture of the slow, torturous degradation of a man who held all of Europe in fear. Henry's medical history didn't begin in his final days, but decades before his death. The first alarming symptoms appeared in the 1530s, when the king was just over 40. Venetian ambassador Marino Giustiniani described strange changes in the monarch's behavior in his dispatches. The king, known for his love of hunting and tournaments, began avoiding physical exertion. His once trim figure rapidly expanded, and his character became increasingly unpredictable. Court physician William Butts recorded in his diary in 1537, "His Majesty suffers from festering sores on his legs that emit a stench detectable from several paces away. These ulcers, which appeared after a tournament injury, never fully healed. Moreover, they gradually enlarged, becoming suppurating wounds that required constant bandaging. By the mid-1540s, the king's condition became critical." French ambassador Odet de Selve wrote to Paris, "The king has grown so fat that he can barely move. His waist circumference exceeds 54 inches, and moving from place to place requires special mechanical devices. Indeed, a system of pulleys and ropes was created to lift the corpulent monarch to the palace's 2nd floor, history's first personal elevator. But physical suffering was only the tip of the iceberg. Henry's character changed catastrophically quickly. The man who in his youth was known as a patron of arts and sciences became a paranoid tyrant. Fits of rage alternated with periods of deep melancholy. The king could sentence an advisor to death for a careless word, then weep over his portrait an hour later. Contemporaries noted other troubling symptoms. The king developed pathological thirst. He consumed enormous quantities of wine and water. But this didn't quench his torment. His skin acquired an unhealthy yellowish tint, and his mouth constantly emitted a sickly sweet odor that courtiers delicately called a divine aroma. The doctors of that time were powerless against the mysterious ailment. They applied all known treatment methods: bloodletting, bowel purging, mercury-based ointments, prayers, and incantations. Nothing helped. Moreover, the king's condition steadily worsened, and his behavior became increasingly eccentric and cruel. The winter of 1546 brought new horrors. What was happening to the king went beyond ordinary illness. It resembled a curse. Henry had become a living puzzle that Europe's best doctors couldn't solve. Dr. Thomas Wendy, the king's personal physician, kept detailed records of his august patient's condition. His diary, discovered in archives only in the 20th century, contains blood-chilling details. The ulcers on His Majesty's legs have reached the size of a human palm. Pus flows continuously, despite all our efforts. The smell is so strong that servants refuse to enter the royal chambers without special masks soaked in aromatic oils. But most alarming was the monarch's behavior. The king, once renowned for his sharp mind and political cunning, began showing signs of serious mental disturbance. He could spend hours talking to portraits of dead wives, accused courtiers of witchcraft, and demanded the execution of people who had long since died natural deaths. Spanish Ambassador Eustace Chapuis described a scene he witnessed during an audience in a secret report to Emperor Charles V. The king suddenly rose from his throne and began shouting at invisible enemies. He waved his arms as if swatting flies and claimed he saw devilish visions. The courtiers recoiled in terror, and I myself barely restrained myself from fleeing. Henry's physical condition continued deteriorating at an alarming rate. By autumn 1546, his weight exceeded 300 pounds, an astronomical figure for a man about 6 feet tall. The king couldn't rise from bed unassisted, and moving him around the palace required 6 healthy men. Courtiers began whispering about the possibility of regency. Prince Edward was only 9 years old, and the prospect of a long reign by an underage monarch with a sick father frightened the political elite. But no one dared openly discuss the king's illness. This was punishable by death as treason. The doctors were in complete bewilderment. 16th century medicine knew no such symptoms. John Chamber, another royal physician, confessed in a letter to a colleague from the University of Padua. "We are dealing with an ailment described neither in Galen's works nor in Avicenna's writings. The king's body seems to be devouring itself from within." The monarch's sudden mood swings particularly frightened the doctors. In the morning, the king could be relatively calm and even discuss state affairs. But by evening, he would fall into rage or deep depression. These episodes were accompanied by physical symptoms, trembling hands, profuse sweating, and choking fits. The royal court had essentially become a hospital. The smell from the king's rotting ulcers penetrated even the palace's distant chambers. Servants burned aromatic herbs and incense, but this helped little. Many court ladies carried perfume-soaked handkerchiefs that they held to their noses when approaching the royal chambers. Henry retained enough mental clarity to understand the horror of his situation. In rare moments of lucidity, he dictated his will, in which he confessed, "God has punished me for my sins, but I pray for his mercy upon my soul and upon my kingdom." These words, recorded by Secretary Thomas Wriothesley, became one of the few testimonies that the king was aware of approaching death. Treatment attempts became increasingly desperate. Doctors applied plasters made from crushed pearls to the ulcers, gave the king decoctions of rare herbs brought from the New World, even tried healing by laying on of hands, inviting renowned healers and holy men. Nothing helped. Moreover, each new procedure seemed only to accelerate the decomposition of the royal body. By early 1547, it became clear that the end was near. The king spent 18 to 20 hours a day in bed, and his waking periods were accompanied by excruciating pain. He demanded constant presence of priests and spent hours in confession, trying to cleanse his soul before meeting his creator. What was really killing Henry VIII? 16th century doctors could only describe symptoms without understanding their nature. Modern medicine reveals an entirely different picture, a medical history that could have changed the course of world history. Dr. Robert Hutchinson from the London Royal College of Physicians conducted revolutionary research in 1990. After analyzing all available historical documents about the king's health, he reached a shocking conclusion. Henry VIII suffered from type 2 diabetes in extremely severe form. This explained practically all symptoms: obesity, non-healing wounds, sweet breath odor, constant thirst, and sudden mood swings. Imagine a person whose blood sugar levels exceeded normal by 10 to 15 times. In the 16th century, this was a sentence to agonizing death. Diabetes literally devoured the king's body from within, transforming the once mighty monarch into living ruins. Ketoacidosis, a condition where the body begins breaking down its own fats due to inability to process glucose, explained the sweet breath odor that contemporaries noted. But the diabetes version isn't the only one. Dr. Kyra Williams from Oxford University proposed an alternative hypothesis in the 2000s. In her opinion, the king suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a disease caused by excessive production of the hormone cortisol. This ailment explained the rapid weight gain, purple stretch marks on the king's skin that court physicians noted. and catastrophic character changes. Cushing's syndrome turns people into uncontrollable monsters. Excess cortisol causes aggression, paranoia, and deep depression. Suddenly it becomes clear why the good-natured young Henry became a bloodthirsty tyrant. His brain literally swam in stress hormones, making normal behavior impossible. A third hypothesis is even more sinister. Some researchers, including Dr. John Ashdown Hill, believe the king suffered from syphilis. This disease in its tertiary stage affects the nervous system, causing exactly the mental disturbances that Henry demonstrated. Non-healing ulcers, progressive dementia, fits of rage, all classic symptoms of neurosyphilis. If this version is correct, then a terrifying picture emerges. A king infected with venereal disease in his youth from numerous mistresses slowly went mad over decades. His decisions about executing wives, breaking with Rome, and religious persecution were made by a man with a disease-damaged brain. England's history might have unfolded completely differently if not for this infection. 16th century doctors, of course, knew nothing about diabetes, Cushing's syndrome, or neurosyphilis. They treated the king with methods that only hastened his death. Bloodletting weakened his already exhausted organism. Mercury ointments, applied against supposed French disease, as syphilis was then called, caused additional poisoning. Diets of raw meat and red wine with diabetes were tantamount to slow suicide. Dr. Thomas Linacre, founder of the Royal College of Physicians, confessed in his records, "We wander in darkness, trying to heal an ailment whose nature is unknown to us." Indeed, medieval medicine was powerless against endocrine disorders and infectious diseases of the nervous system. Particularly tragic was the doctor's inability to understand the connection between diet and the king's condition. Henry continued consuming enormous quantities of sweets, fried meat, and alcohol, exactly what is contraindicated for diabetes. Royal feasts became slow torture. Every morsel of food brought the monarch closer to death. Modern endocrinologists who have studied descriptions of Henry's symptoms are unanimous. With proper treatment, the king could have lived for decades more. Diet, physical exercise, and even primitive medicines based on plant extracts could have controlled blood sugar levels. But in the 16th century, such knowledge was unavailable. Interestingly, some courtiers intuitively understood the connection between the king's lifestyle and his illness. Thomas More, executed for refusing to recognize Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, warned in one of his letters, "Intemperance in food and drink is a direct road to the grave." Prophetic words, considering they were written 15 years before the king's death. January 28, 1547. Henry VIII died at 2 a.m, leaving behind not only a shattered Europe, but also a medical mystery that would torment historians for centuries. But the most gruesome began after death. What the doctors discovered during autopsy exceeded all their terrible expectations. According to royal protocol of that time, the monarch had to be embalmed for ceremonial burial. This procedure required complete dissection of the body and removal of internal organs. Dr. Thomas Wendy, the chief royal physician, and his assistants began this grim work just hours after death. The first thing that struck the doctors was the incredible size of the royal body. The corpse weighed more than 320 pounds, and chest circumference exceeded 58 inches. But when the doctors made the first incision, true horror awaited them. Dr. Wendy later recorded in his diary, "What we discovered inside His late Majesty's body was so horrifying that I dare not describe it completely. The king's abdominal cavity was filled with pus and decomposed tissue. The liver had enlarged to the size of a human head and acquired an unhealthy yellow-green color. But the most shocking awaited the doctors when they reached the heart. The organ that once sustained the life of Europe's most powerful monarch was surrounded by a hard, stone-like shell. This condition, which modern cardiologists call pericardial calcification, had turned Henry's heart into something resembling a stone bag. Every contraction of the heart muscle caused the king unbearable pain, explaining the choking fits and chest pain that tormented him in his final months. In fact, the king was dying of heart failure, aggravated by multiple complications. The monarch's lungs were saturated with fluid and covered with strange growths that 16th century doctors couldn't identify. Modern pathologists suppose these were tuberculous granulomas, signs of the body's prolonged struggle with infection. It turns out that the king suffered from tuberculosis for years without knowing it. But the most horrifying discoveries awaited in the lower part of the body. The famous ulcers on the king's legs proved to be only the visible part of the catastrophe. Under the skin of both legs stretched enormous cavities filled with pus and dead tissue. Bones were partially destroyed, and muscles had turned into a fetid mass. Dr. John Chamber, present at the autopsy, later confessed to a colleague, "I don't understand how His Majesty could endure such suffering. Any ordinary person would have died from pain shock within days. Indeed, that the king lived for years with such destruction in his body borders on miraculous." The condition of the king's brain particularly amazed the doctors. Upon extraction, they discovered that brain tissue had an uncharacteristic pinkish tint and was riddled with small hemorrhages. Modern neurologists suppose these could have been consequences of multiple microstrokes, which explain the sharp changes in the monarch's character and behavior. The king's kidneys had literally dissolved. Instead of normal organs, doctors found shriveled, scar-covered formations the size of a child's fist. This explained Henry's constant thirst and the color change of his urine that servants noted. The king was dying of kidney failure without knowing it. The monarch's stomach contained remains of his last meal, pieces of roasted swan, candied fruits, and remnants of red wine. But the stomach walls were covered with ulcers and inflamed areas. Every meal became torture for the king, though he continued eating with his former appetite. The embalming procedure became a nightmare. Usually aromatic oils and spices were used to preserve royal bodies, but the condition of Henry's internal organs made this impossible. Doctors were forced to remove practically all internal organs and fill body cavities with incense-soaked fabrics. The most gruesome discovery was the condition of the king's spine. Several vertebrae were literally destroyed by infection, explaining the constant back pain that tormented Henry in recent years. The king couldn't walk normally, not only because of obesity, but also because of bone tissue destruction. Dr. Wendy concluded his records with words that convey all the horror of what happened. Our late sovereign's body was afflicted with diseases so numerous and severe that one can only wonder how the soul could so long inhabit such ruined flesh. Henry VIII's death spawned numerous myths and legends that distort the truth about the king's final days. It's time to debunk the most popular misconceptions and separate historical facts from artistic fiction. The first and most persistent myth is the story that the king was poisoned. This version is especially popular in modern historical detective novels and films. Supposedly courtiers, tired of the monarch's tyranny, slipped poison into his wine. Some authors even name specific suspects, from the Duke of Norfolk to his last wife, Catherine Parr. Reality is much more prosaic. Autopsy results showed no signs of poisoning. Moreover, the king's illness symptoms developed over decades, which excludes the use of fast-acting poisons. Arsenic and other popular poisons of that time leave characteristic traces in tissues, which doctors didn't find. Dr. Susan Lipscomb from the University of East Anglia, who specializes in Tudor medical history, is categorical. There's no evidence of poisoning. All of Henry's symptoms are explained by natural diseases known to modern medicine. The poison version is simply an attempt to romanticize a mundane medical tragedy. The second misconception concerns the so-called Tudor curse. According to this theory, the dynasty was cursed for executing innocent people, and Henry's illness was divine retribution. Particularly popular is the version about Anne Boleyn's curse, who supposedly cursed the king before execution. Historical documents refute this romantic version. Anne Boleyn delivered a traditional speech before death in which she asked the king's forgiveness and wished him long life. She pronounced no curses. Moreover, Henry's illness symptoms appeared even before Anne's execution, making any connection between these events impossible. The third myth claims the king suffered from syphilis, infected by prostitutes in his youth. This version is so firmly rooted in mass consciousness that many consider it proven. Indeed, some of Henry's symptoms resemble manifestations of tertiary syphilis, ulcers, mental disturbances, heart problems. However, modern research casts doubt on this version. Dr. Catherine MacLeod from Glasgow University notes, syphilis in the 16th century progressed much more aggressively than Henry's described symptoms. The king would have lived a maximum of 5 to 7 years after infection, not several decades. Additionally, syphilitic ulcers usually heal spontaneously, which didn't happen with the king's wounds. The fourth misconception relates to heredity. Many authors claim Henry inherited his diseases from his father, Henry VII. Supposedly, the entire Tudor line suffered from some family disease passed down through generations. Medical records refute this theory. Henry VII died at age 52 from tuberculosis, a completely different disease. His symptoms were radically different from his son's illness. The only thing connecting father and son was a tendency toward obesity in mature age, which is explained by lifestyle, not genetics. Another popular myth concerns stress's role in disease development. According to this version, the king became ill due to worries about the absence of a legitimate male heir. Constant marriages and divorces, wife executions, religious upheavals, all this supposedly undermined the monarch's health. Modern psychosomatic medicine indeed recognizes stress's influence on physical health. However, chronic diseases Henry suffered from have a completely different nature. Type 2 diabetes develops due to genetic predisposition and improper lifestyle, not emotional experiences. Stress could aggravate symptoms, but wasn't the primary cause of illness. The sixth misconception claims the king could have recovered with proper treatment. This version is especially popular among alternative historians who speculate how England's history would have changed if Henry had lived longer. Reality is harsh. With the medical level of that time, the king was doomed. Even modern treatment methods aren't always effective with such advanced forms of diabetes and heart failure. In the 16th century, such diseases were absolutely fatal. Any treatment attempts only hastened the agony. The seventh myth concerns the king's deathbed visions. According to some sources, the dying Henry saw ghosts of people he had executed. Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, monks from dissolved monasteries. These stories became the basis for numerous mystical works. Medical records explain these visions prosaically. Severe diabetes causes hallucinations due to brain function disruption. Ketoacidosis, a condition where the body is poisoned by fat breakdown products, causes vivid visual and auditory hallucinations. No mysticism, just the biochemistry of a dying brain. The medical history and death of Henry VIII isn't just a medical case from the distant past. It's a lesson about how physical ailments can change the course of world history and what price humanity pays for ignorance in health matters. Imagine an alternative reality. A healthy Henry, not suffering from diabetes and not tormented by constant pain. Perhaps this king wouldn't have executed Anne Boleyn in a fit of diabetic rage, sudden fury caused by blood sugar spikes. Maybe England would have remained a Catholic country, and the Reformation would have taken a completely different path. Henry's illness influenced every decision he made in the last 15 years of his reign. Thomas More's execution, monastery dissolution, Catholic persecution. All these historical events occurred under the influence of a sick, suffering brain. Protestator Lucy Worsley, curator of historic palaces, notes, "We study Henry's politics, forgetting that decisions were made by a man in a state of chronic intoxication by his own hormones and breakdown products. Modern endocrinology explains many mysteries of the king's character. Sudden mood swings, paranoid episodes, uncontrolled aggression, all classic symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes. The king literally wasn't responsible for his actions during hyperglycemic crises, when blood sugar levels reached critical values. The story of Catherine Howard, the king's fifth wife, looks particularly tragic. The 19-year-old girl was executed for adultery in 1542, when Henry's illness reached its peak. Modern psychiatrists suggest that accusations against the young wife could have been products of the king's pathological hallucinations caused by diabetic encephalopathy. Henry's medical history also demonstrates how 16th-century elite lifestyle killed its practitioners. Endless feasts, lack of physical activity, stress from governing the state, all this created ideal conditions for developing type 2 diabetes. Paradox. The richer and more powerful a person was, the greater his risk of dying from diseases of abundance. Royal doctors of that time unwittingly hastened their patients' death. The diet they recommended, fried meat, sweet wines, candied fruits, was a direct path to diabetic coma. Bloodletting, which was supposed to purify bad blood, only weakened an organism fighting infections. Mercury ointments against supposed syphilis poisoned an already diseased liver. Henry's death became a turning point in medical history. Detailed records by royal physicians recorded for the first time in history the complete clinical picture of severe diabetes. These documents, studied only in the 20th century, helped understand the nature of a disease that today affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Modern diabetologists call Henry VIII's case a classic textbook example. If the king lived today, his condition would be easily controlled with insulin, proper diet, and physical exercise. The man who held all Europe in fear died from a disease that modern medicine treats on an outpatient basis. Henry's medical history teaches us another important lesson. Even the most perfect power is powerless before biological laws. A king who could execute any subject with one word couldn't order his pancreas to produce insulin. An absolute monarch proved absolutely defenseless against microscopic processes in his own body. The psychological portrait of the dying king strikes with its tragedy. A man accustomed to controlling everything around him gradually lost control over his own body. This explains many cruel decisions of recent years: executions, persecutions, paranoid suspicions. Henry tried to compensate for physical weakness by intensifying political terror. The king's illness influence on the English Reformation is still underestimated by historians. The break with Rome, creation of the Anglican Church, secularization of monastic lands. All these epical events occurred under the influence of a sick, suffering man. Perhaps Europe's religious map would look completely different today if Henry had been healthy. So what have we learned from this horrifying medical history? First, rulers' diseases can change the course of world history. Second, ignoring symptoms and improper treatment turn curable diseases into fatal ones. Third, even absolute power doesn't protect against biological laws. Today, when diabetes has become a global epidemic, Henry VIII's story sounds particularly relevant. Proper nutrition, regular physical exercise, and timely medical consultation. These are simple rules that could have saved the life of his time's most powerful monarch. What do you think about the influence of historical figures' health on the course of history? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to our channel to learn more shocking facts about the lives and deaths of great people from the past.